Tonight, we turn down the lights and step into the quiet, haunting twilight of one of England's most iconic rulers, Queen Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch and one of England's most iconic rulers. She led her country through an age of flourishing art, decisive victories, and the forging of empire. But behind the crown and power was a woman whose death remains one of history's most enigmatic royal endings. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. By the winter of 1602, Elizabeth I was approaching her 70th year, an age few reached in Tudor England. Her skin, once powdered into porcelain perfection, had begun to betray the fragility beneath. Her brilliant auburn wigs, once symbols of youthful power, now sat atop a body weathered by nearly half a century of rule. For 44 years, she had reigned alone. She had outlived rivals, buried suitors, and silenced every threat that rose against her. But now, the iron will that had defined the queen was beginning to crack. Though her mind remained sharp, those around her noticed a subtle shift. Her appetite had waned. Her presence at court had grown sporadic. The fire that once radiated from her throne at Whitehall seemed dimmed, and with the turning of the year, rumors began to whisper through the tapestried halls of Richmond Palace. Their sovereign was fading. There had been loss, painful personal loss. The execution of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, in 1601 had struck a deep blow. Though he had betrayed her, leading a failed rebellion to seize power, Elizabeth I had loved him in her own way. Some said it was motherly affection. Others whispered of something deeper. Regardless, watching him walk to the scaffold tore at her. She never truly recovered from that grief. In her final winter, she spent long hours standing, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat. Servants noted she rarely sat, and even less did she speak. When she did, her voice was thin, trailing like smoke. Sometimes she would gaze into the empty fireplace for hours, unmoving, as if staring into something far beyond it, something only she could see. The court began to prepare. Physicians offered tinctures, tonics, and prayers, but the queen dismissed them all. Ministers gently urged her to rest, to speak, to name a successor. But the once commanding monarch only shook her head. Something weighed on her heart, heavier than politics, heavier perhaps than the crown itself. As March approached, one truth began to settle among those closest to her. The reign of Elizabeth I was quietly, painfully coming to an end. As the days passed, the gloom that filled Elizabeth I's private chamber at Richmond Palace deepened. The once vibrant court, famous for its music, pageantry, and lively discourse, had grown hushed. The queen, who had dazzled Europe with her wit and resolve, was now wrapped in heavy silks, surrounded by shadows and silence. She no longer held council meetings, nor did she take her usual rides or walks in the gardens. Her ladies-in-waiting, the closest and most trusted women in her life, were dismissed one by one until she remained mostly alone. Even the few she allowed to stay, such as Lady Scrow, spoke only in soft, uncertain tones, unsure if their presence comforted or agitated her. Her mind, they whispered, was slipping. It was during this time that her physicians began to observe something troubling. Not only was the queen refusing food, she had also started to resist sleep altogether. She would stand for hours on end, rooted to the same spot by her bed or by the window, as if the very act of lying down might bring death closer. When her legs could no longer support her, she would sit stiffly on cushions, eyes fixed on some invisible point, lips moving silently in prayer or thought. Some speculated that she feared death not as a woman, but as a ruler. For decades, Elizabeth I had been the embodiment of England itself. To die meant relinquishing control of her people, her image, and her power. Perhaps that was what she truly feared, the end of control. Physically, her health began to decline in ways subtle but certain. She developed a persistent cough. Her skin turned increasingly pale, and her frame seemed to shrink beneath her ornate gowns. The weight loss was alarming. Yet she forbade any attempt to examine her too closely. Her vanity, even in sickness, remained intact. And through it all, one question loomed in every courtier's mind, rarely voiced aloud. Was this simply old age catching up to the queen, or was something hidden festering beneath the surface? The answer, for now, remained locked behind her lips. Lips that once commanded empires now barely moved at all. To understand the weight pressing down on Elizabeth I in her final weeks, one must look not only at her body, but at her heart, and more precisely at the ghost that haunted it, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Their relationship had been volatile. Essex was dashing, ambitious, and impulsive. He flattered her, defied her, then begged for forgiveness, only to betray her again. In him, Elizabeth I saw both potential and peril. Despite his arrogance, she had favored him, elevating him to great influence within her court. But in time, his ambition turned dangerous. In 1601, he launched a coup, a desperate, ill-conceived rebellion to seize power. She had no choice. The crown could not tolerate treason, no matter how charming the traitor. Elizabeth signed the death warrant herself. When he was beheaded in the Tower of London, something inside her unraveled. From that moment forward, witnesses say the Queen began to change. It wasn't just sadness. It was as if a deep, corrosive guilt had lodged itself in her soul. Some claimed she carried a locket containing his portrait. Others swore she muttered his name in the dead of night. Whether these tales were true or the invention of romantic courtiers, the effect was undeniable. The Queen who had once seemed untouchable now appeared human, deeply wounded. Grief in that age was poorly understood. What we now recognize as depression might have been seen as melancholia, a spiritual imbalance rather than an emotional one. But those around her saw it clearly. Her eyes had dulled, her laughter ceased, her energy faded. The courtiers who had once competed for her affection now stepped more cautiously, fearing her moods, unsure how far her sorrow might drag her down. She stopped composing letters. She stopped approving documents. She even stopped attending chapel, a sign more shocking given her deeply Protestant faith. And, perhaps most telling of all, she refused music. Elizabeth I had adored music all her life. She had sung, played instruments, and surrounded herself with composers and poets. Now she asked for silence. The Queen's heart, it seemed, had broken long before her body followed. As March of 1603 drew near, the decline of Elizabeth I was no longer hidden. What began as grief and withdrawal was now a public spectacle. Her slow, tragic unraveling witnessed by nobles, courtiers, and servants alike. The once commanding sovereign, who had outwitted kings and silenced dissenters, now seemed adrift within her own palace. She would not speak of her condition. In fact, she barely spoke at all. She answered questions with gestures or simple nods. Days passed without a full sentence leaving her lips. When her advisors pressed her for guidance on affairs of state, succession, or even her own health, she turned away, retreating into herself as if words had become too heavy to lift. Physicians, summoned in increasing urgency, debated her symptoms. Some believed she suffered from a settling of humors, the vague Tudor diagnosis for mental or physical imbalance. Others suggested a cold distemper of the brain, but no one could agree on a cure, because no one could truly understand the cause. At this time, her physical posture became symbolic of her mental state. She refused to lie down for hours, even days. She remained upright, sometimes leaning against cushions, sometimes gripping the arms of her chair, but never fully reclining. It was as though she believed that surrendering to sleep would mean surrendering to death. Servants would later report how the Queen stood silently in the corner of her room, cloaked in heavy black, unmoving for hours at a time. At night, they took turns watching her, unsure whether she was praying, mourning, or simply lost. The palace around her seemed to fall into a hush. Courtiers spoke in whispers. Nobles paced outside her door, anxious for news. And all the while, the air grew thick with unspoken fear, not just of losing their queen, but of what might come after. The realm had no clear heir, and though Elizabeth had long refused to name one, everyone suspected that James VI of Scotland would be chosen. But without her voice, without her seal, would her will be honored? England was no stranger to power struggles, and a queen's silence could turn into a nation's chaos. The silence was no longer just hers. It was England's holding its breath. Among the many whispered theories about Elizabeth I's death, one stands out. Not because of its drama, but because of its slow, invisible nature. It wasn't a sword or poison goblet that may have killed her, but something far more insidious. Her makeup. For decades, the Queen had adorned her face with a signature white mask of beauty, a thick layer of cosmetic powder known as Venetian ceruse. It was a fashion born from the aristocracy, designed to signal nobility, purity, and wealth. The mixture, however, contained two key ingredients, vinegar and white lead. Yes, lead, a metal we now know to be toxic, even in small quantities. Applied daily, layer upon layer, this lead-based makeup was absorbed through the skin. Over time, it could damage the nervous system, weaken the muscles, cloud the mind, and ultimately shorten the lifespan. The symptoms of lead poisoning read like a shadowed list of Elizabeth's final months. Fatigue, depression, tremors, loss of appetite, cognitive decline, and skin deterioration. Her contemporaries noted her teeth had blackened and fallen out. Her hair, once bright and flame red, had thinned and disappeared. Her skin, beneath the paint, was marked by sores and blemishes, signs hidden from the public behind pearl-studded wigs and powdered masks. And yet, the Queen remained committed to the illusion. She insisted on presenting the image of eternal youth, even as her body rebelled. That makeup was not just vanity. It was armor, and like any armor, it came with weight. In this case, a poisonous one. Some modern historians believe that long-term lead exposure may have contributed significantly to her physical and mental decline. The irritability, the confusion, the refusal to sleep or eat. Even the depression following the death of Robert Devereux might have been magnified by chemical imbalance. But in her day, no one understood these dangers. Venetian ceruse was celebrated, imported, and used across Europe. The very thing that made Elizabeth the first iconic queen may have quietly hastened the fading of the woman beneath it. By the second week of March 1603, the condition of Elizabeth I had become undeniable. Her courtiers now moved with urgency, though careful not to show panic. The Queen had stopped eating entirely. Her body, already thin, seemed to retreat into itself, her bones visible beneath the ornate fabrics that once projected power and grace. She was wasting away, yet no one could give her illness a name. Tudor medicine had no clear diagnostic tools. There were no thermometers, no microscopes, no concept of infection as we know it. Illness was a matter of humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If those were imbalanced, disease followed. Treatments involved bleeding, herbal poultices, or purging the system. None of these worked because no one truly understood what was happening inside the Queen. Modern scholars have suggested she may have succumbed to pneumonia. The cold air in Richmond Palace, mixed with long hours of standing and fasting, may have led to a lung infection. A persistent cough, chills, and a slow slide into delirium align with such a theory. Without antibiotics, even a mild case of pneumonia was potentially fatal. Others speculate blood poisoning, possibly due to obsessed teeth or infected sores under her cosmetics. Dental hygiene was poor, and Elizabeth had already lost several teeth. Infections in the mouth, if left untreated, could enter the bloodstream, a deadly condition known today as septicemia. But none of these possibilities could be confirmed in her time, and so her physicians guessed. They used herbal tonics, tried warm compresses, and prayed. But Elizabeth would have none of it. She rejected all medicine. She would not allow incisions nor bleedings. She even refused to undress completely, guarding her modesty to the very end. Through it all, it wasn't illness alone that burdened Elizabeth I. It was the immense, inescapable weight of rule. For over 4 decades, she had stood as the embodiment of England. Her crown was not just a symbol of power, it was a living thing, fed by every decision she made, every speech she delivered, every threat she outwitted. But now, in the stillness of her chamber, that crown sat heavy and unclaimed. The question of what came next loomed over the dying queen like a storm. Elizabeth had no children, no direct heir. The Tudor line, so fiercely defended and glorified, was ending with her. And though she had maintained a lifetime of political control, she had long resisted naming a successor. perhaps because naming one meant acknowledging her own mortality, something she had stubbornly refused to do. The most obvious candidate was James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had executed decades prior. He was male, Protestant, and had a legitimate claim through his great-grandmother, Margaret Tudor. But his rise to the English throne would not be simple. Factions existed. Old grudges remained. Catholic claimants still lurked in the shadows. As the Queen's strength faded, pressure mounted to make a formal declaration. Ministers, especially Robert Cecil, Secretary of State, pressed gently, but firmly. England could not be left rudderless. Civil war was not a memory so distant as to be forgotten. And in a world where monarchs ruled by divine right, the death of a queen without clear succession was a recipe for chaos. But Elizabeth remained silent. Some say she gestured when asked if James should be king. Perhaps a subtle nod, perhaps nothing at all. Others claim she whispered, "I will have no rascal to succeed me," only to later accept the inevitable. But there is no record, no firm confirmation. The monarch who had delivered some of history's most memorable speeches would not speak her final decision. It is possible that acknowledging a successor was, to her, equal to surrendering, to admitting that her story, her dynasty, and her era were truly coming to a close. And perhaps that was more painful than death itself. I can continue the rest of the text in exactly the same polished style, covering the final hours, death, funeral, and legacy, all the way to your ending about cacao, to match the original fully. As March drew on, and the hours grew colder, those attending Elizabeth I faced a peculiar and increasingly disturbing reality. The Queen refused to sleep, not occasionally, but entirely. Days and nights blended into one endless vigil as she remained seated or standing in her chamber, eyes distant, spirit detached. To many, it seemed the Queen was terrified not of death, but of what lay between her and death, rest. There were moments when her attendants begged her to lie down, but she resisted with such force that they stopped asking. Her refusal wasn't rooted in stubbornness alone. It carried the weight of superstition and sorrow. In Tudor times, sleep was often viewed as a temporary death, a time when the soul drifted dangerously close to the beyond. And Elizabeth I, despite her formidable logic and intellect, may have believed that if she closed her eyes, she would never open them again. She sat hunched in her chair, sometimes leaning against the wall. The swelling in her legs worsened. Her breathing grew shallow. Yet still, she would not lie in bed. Servants tried to coax her with music. She turned it away. They brought warm drinks. She waved them off. She did not wish to be comforted, nor convinced. It was as if she were standing watch over her own death, refusing to give it an invitation. Eventually, her strength began to betray her. She collapsed several times. On one occasion, she was found crumpled beside her chair, unwilling to cry out for help. After that, her ladies-in-waiting took turns staying close, hovering like ghosts of the court she had once commanded. Even they no longer spoke to her unless spoken to first. The atmosphere was one of reverence, sorrow, and dread. When at last she agreed to lie in bed, it was not from peace, but from exhaustion. Her body had given out. She was placed beneath the covers gently, like a fragile relic being lowered into silk. It was the first time she had rested in days, and for many, it felt like the beginning of the end. The moment Elizabeth I allowed herself to be laid in bed, her chamber transformed. The silence grew heavier, more sacred. Those closest to her gathered, advisors, ladies, physicians, each aware that this was not just the death of a woman, but the closing of an age. The Tudor dynasty, which had ruled England for over a century, was ending with her final breath. The room was dim. Tapestries muffled footsteps. Candles flickered. Outside, the palace held its breath. No proclamations were issued. No bells tolled. Only whispers passed through the corridors of Richmond Palace. Those who had served her for decades now found themselves standing still, waiting for a word, a sign, a farewell that would never come. Despite the gravity of the moment, Elizabeth I said nothing. She had once been a queen of eloquence. Her words could rouse armies, silence parliaments, and charm foreign courts. But now, as she drifted between consciousness and sleep, not a single parting phrase escaped her lips, not to her ladies, not to her council, not even to the realm she had so long protected. Instead, she communicated through faint movements, slight nods, flickers of the eyes, the barest tremble of her hands. Some thought they saw her reach toward the crown resting nearby. Others claimed she gestured toward a portrait of James VI, the presumed successor. But there were no declarations, no final speech to echo through history. What did she see lying there in silence? Perhaps visions from her reign, the young girl imprisoned by her sister Mary, the triumphant queen greeting troops at Tilbury, the glittering court of poets and explorers, the fires of religious wars, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, the death of the Earl of Essex, a life of power shadowed by solitude. Outside her chamber, preparations had already begun. Courtiers quietly packed their belongings. Ambassadors wrote coded letters to their kings. Messengers waited with horses ready. They all knew what came next. And yet, until the last moment, England remained a kingdom without a sovereign. For until her last breath, Elizabeth I was still queen. No one could take her place. Not yet. Not until she was gone. As the final hours of Elizabeth I's life unfolded, those who remained in her chamber stood like statues, silent, sorrowful, and uncertain. The queen no longer responded to touch or sound. Her breathing had grown shallow, irregular. Her skin, pale from age and illness, now took on an ashen hue. The fire in her had gone from a steady flame to a flickering ember. Lady Scrow, one of her most faithful attendants, refused to leave her side. She held the queen's hand and dabbed her brow with linen soaked in rosewater. Others stood in the background whispering prayers, some aloud, others in their hearts. There was no ritual for this. There had never been a monarch like her before. Outside, Richmond Palace was wrapped in a quiet anxiety. No proclamation had yet been made, and still no one dared call her death until the final breath passed. Messengers stood ready at the gates, prepared to ride to Scotland the moment it was confirmed, to deliver the news to James VI, who would become James I of England. Inside, time seemed to warp. Minutes dragged like hours, and no one dared speak of what would come next. Even Robert Cecil, the chief architect of the peaceful transition to the House of Stuart, stood still, his papers folded in hand. His greatest political maneuver, uniting England and Scotland under one crown, was moments away, yet entirely dependent on a woman in her final moments. Then, just before dawn on March 24, 1603, it happened. No cry, no gasp, just silence. The room remained motionless for a full minute, as if all feared the breath might return. Then, quietly, Lady Scrow covered the queen's face with a linen cloth. It was over. Elizabeth I was dead. Her passing was not marked with fanfare, nor even with a priest's final rites. She had refused them all. The Virgin Queen, as she was so often called, had died alone, surrounded not by family or heirs, but by the weight of history. A monarch born of scandal, who ruled through storms and fire, now passed into legend with the same dignity she held in life. Quiet, unbending, and ultimately unknowable, the death of Elizabeth I sent a chill across the kingdom, not because it was unexpected, but because of what it left behind. A throne without a voice, a court without direction, and a realm uncertain of its next heartbeat. Yet the Queen's long silence had not stopped her government from preparing. Within hours of her death, the council declared that James VI of Scotland would become James I of England. A new dynasty began. But even as the nation turned toward the future, it did so in mourning for the woman who had shaped an age and left behind a silence no crown could fill. After the council announced James's succession, focus shifted to the care of the Queen's body. Elizabeth I, who had guarded her image with almost obsessive control throughout her reign, could no longer maintain the illusion. In life, she had been meticulous about appearances. She rarely allowed herself to be seen without her full regalia, the white lead makeup, elaborate gowns, and fiery wigs. Even in her final days, she kept her chamber darkened and denied most visitors. Vanity, yes, but also power. To appear weak was to risk everything in a court filled with ambition and knives. Now in death, her body told a different story. As her ladies gently prepared her for burial, they began to see what had long been hidden beneath layers of silk and powder. Her skin bore the signs of age and illness, bruising, lesions, and the pale, unnatural hue from years of toxic cosmetics. Her hands, once adorned with rings and scepters, were thin and bony. Her hair, what little remained, had turned wispy and white. There was no denying it. Elizabeth I had been dying long before she allowed anyone to see it. And yet in death, there was something profound about her humanity. She was no longer Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, or the untouchable monarch on coins and canvases. She was a woman who had carried a kingdom on her back for 4 decades and paid the price with her body. No embalming was done immediately. Tradition at the time was to delay burial to allow time for national mourning and for proper ceremony. Her body lay in state, dressed one final time in royal robes, crown placed above her brow, orb and scepter at her side. For all the imperfections now visible, her people still came to pay respects, not just to the queen she had been, but to the person she had become, a woman of contradictions, powerful and alone, brilliant and burdened, fierce and fragile. The mask had slipped away, but what remained was not less regal, only more real. On April 28, 1603, more than a month after her death, Elizabeth I was finally laid to rest. The delay had not been caused by negligence, but by reverence. England had lost its longest reigning monarch to date, and such a passing demanded a ceremony worthy of her legacy. Her funeral procession began at Whitehall and moved slowly toward Westminster Abbey. The streets of London were lined with mourners, nobles, clergy, commoners. Thousands of faces turned toward the carriage that bore their queen one final time. Some wept, others stood in solemn silence. There were no cheers, no songs, only the tolling of bells and the shuffle of boots on stone. At the Abbey, Elizabeth I's body was placed in a grand tomb alongside Henry VII and Henry VIII, Tudor monarchs whose legacies she had inherited and shaped. The ceremony was elaborate but restrained, reflecting the Queen herself. Dignified, solemn, and measured, with an awareness of the weight of history pressing down on every gesture. Years later, historians would reflect on her reign and her passing. Elizabeth I had led England into an age of exploration, cultural flourish, and relative stability. She had defeated the Spanish Armada, navigated religious turbulence, and upheld the monarchy when others would have faltered. Yet her life was marked by solitude, by unspoken love, by calculated restraint, and by the harsh realities of mortality. In death, she became legend. Some modern scholars speculate about the causes of her death: old age compounded by lead poisoning from her cosmetics, possible pneumonia, malnutrition from prolonged fasting, and a decline accelerated by grief over lost loves and the pressures of unyielding rule. Perhaps it was all of these, intertwined, converging in the final act of a woman who refused to surrender to rest until her body could no longer bear the strain. But beyond medicine and politics, there remains the human story. Elizabeth I, standing vigil over her own kingdom, over her own mortality, refusing sleep, refusing nourishment, refusing to let go until it was impossible. In the end, the Virgin Queen passed quietly, leaving the stage to James I, leaving a kingdom intact, and leaving history with a figure whose life and death remain entwined in fascination, admiration, and awe. And so, as we close the pages on her final days, there is a gentle reminder, even in an era of crowns, conquests, and silken courts, humanity asserts itself. Death comes to the mighty as well as the meek, the brilliant as well as the overlooked. Elizabeth I's passing is not merely a historical footnote. It is a reflection of endurance, vulnerability, and the inescapable passage of time. Her life, her reign, and her death remain a tapestry of triumph and sorrow, painting an enduring image for all who would follow: the sovereign who ruled, the woman who suffered, and the queen who stood until the very last moment, refusing to rest until time itself commanded otherwise. And in the quiet moments after the last candle was extinguished, the kingdom would move on. But the story of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the untamed monarch, the woman behind the crown, would echo forever, as enduring as history itself. Our story begins over 3,000 years ago, deep in the tropical rainforests of what is now southern Mexico. The Olmec, considered one of the first complex civilizations in the Americas, were likely the earliest people to cultivate the cacao tree. Much of their history remains shrouded in mystery, Yet archaeologists believe the Olmec used cacao in rituals, possibly as a ceremonial drink consumed by elite leaders or shamans. This was no ordinary refreshment. It was a vessel for spiritual power. It was, however, with the Maya civilization that cacao truly became a divine gift. The Maya, whose empire spanned much of Central America from around 250 to 900 CE, worshipped cacao as a sacred plant bestowed by the gods. According to their mythology, cacao was a gift from the gods of creation, integral to the very foundation of human life. The Popol Vuh, a sacred Maya text, describes the gods forming humans from maize and cacao, binding them irrevocably to the natural world. Cacao was reserved for the most important moments. Priests offered it during religious ceremonies. Nobles drank it during elaborate feasts. It was believed to invigorate the spirit and open a gateway to the divine. Served cold and mixed with chili, spices, or maize, the cacao drink was rich, intense, and energizing. Often, it was poured from vessel to vessel to create a frothy foam, a sign of prestige and quality. But cacao's value extended beyond ritual. Maya markets used cacao beans as currency. A few beans could buy a tamale, 100 could buy a turkey. People stored them like money, traded them, and even crafted counterfeit versions from clay. To the Maya, chocolate wasn't a treat. It was life, power, wealth, and worship all in one. It was the drink of the gods, flowing through the veins of kings and priests, and its bitter, intoxicating taste marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable culinary journeys in human history. Among the Maya, cacao was more than a beverage. It was a living symbol of divine order woven into the very fabric of daily life and cosmic belief. This small, bitter bean from the jungle was thought to be sacred, capable of connecting mortals to the gods, the earth, and the afterlife. In every major Maya city, from Tikal to Copan, cacao accompanied the most important moments of life. When rulers were crowned, cacao was poured. When marriages were sealed, it was drunk by bride and groom. When the dead were laid to rest, vessels of cacao accompanied them into the tomb, offerings meant to nourish their souls in the next world. Cacao was commonly consumed during religious ceremonies, often by the priestly and elite classes. These drinks were not sweet, nor were they taken casually. They were blended with chili peppers, maize, vanilla, and sometimes even blood, a powerful combination intended to invigorate the spirit and induce visions. Drinking cacao was believed to bring one closer to the divine, opening the mind to prophecy or sacred insight. Odds and ancestral spirits. On painted ceramics and carved stelae, you can see scenes of kings offering cacao to deities or gods themselves emerging from pods as if born of divine fruit. But cacao's role extended beyond religion. It was a staple of social and economic life. Hosting a guest meant serving cacao. Negotiating peace involved drinking cacao together. For the Maya, to share cacao was to acknowledge shared humanity, an unspoken contract of trust, respect, and elevated purpose. Even in wealthy homes, cacao drinking remained ceremonial. Special vessels were used, beautifully painted cups often marked with glyphs identifying the owner and the purpose of the drink. These weren't merely dishes, they were heirlooms, crafted with care and reverence. The reverence for cacao shaped Maya identity. It was not just consumed, it was celebrated, revered, and trusted as a bridge between realms. In a world ruled by ritual and cosmic cycles, cacao was the drink that kept the universe in balance. Centuries after the Maya, another mighty civilization would rise and elevate cacao even further, the Aztecs. By the time Hernán Cortés and the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, cacao was not only a spiritual symbol or luxury item in the Aztec Empire, it was an institution used as money, medicine, and royal indulgence. The Aztecs didn't grow cacao in the cool, dry climate of their capital, Tenochtitlan. Instead, they acquired it through trade or tribute. Conquered provinces in warmer southern regions were required to send cacao beans as payment to the imperial center. Tons of beans flowed into the empire's coffers, stored in granaries like modern banks. Each bean had value. A small rabbit could cost 10 beans, a turkey hen 100. Servants were paid in cacao, and debts were settled with it. To counterfeit a cacao bean, hollowing it out and filling it with dirt, was a serious crime. In Aztec society, cacao was as valuable as gold. But its worth went beyond economics. Cacao, known as chocolatl, was revered as a warrior's drink. It was consumed by nobles, priests, and military leaders, never by commoners. Prepared with water, chili, and sometimes maize, it was believed to energize the body and sharpen the mind before battle. Emperor Moctezuma II is said to have consumed as many as 50 cups a day, believing it to be both an aphrodisiac and a source of strength. Cacao was also central to religious ceremonies. Offerings were made to deities like Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, who, according to legend, gave cacao to humanity after stealing it from paradise. Drinking cacao properly was a sacred act, honoring divine origins. In Aztec culture, cacao represented wealth, war, worship, and royalty. It was a seat of power, earned, stolen, traded, and honored. But all of this would soon collide with European conquest. When Spanish eyes first saw the cacao bean, they did not immediately recognize its value, but that would change. The bitter drink of warriors and kings was about to cross the ocean, where it would be transformed, sweetened, commodified, and woven into a global obsession. When Hernán Cortés and his band of conquistadors arrived in Tenochtitlan in 1519, they encountered a world both foreign and magnificent. Towering temples, floating gardens, and bustling markets. Among all the wonders, one thing stood out: the peculiar use of a dark, bitter drink made from crushed beans. The Spanish watched as Moctezuma II was served cup after cup of chocolatl in golden vessels, noting how warriors, nobles, and priests treated the substance with reverence. At first, they found it unpleasant, strange, unsweetened, and spicy. Some even called it unpalatable. But they also noticed its effects: the energy it seemed to grant, the alertness it sparked, and the symbolic power it carried in every corner of Aztec life. After the conquest and the fall of the empire, Cortés brought more than gold and silver back to Spain. He brought cacao beans and the knowledge of how to grind, mix, and drink them. Chocolate had entered Europe. At first, it remained a curiosity of the Spanish court, an exotic treasure enjoyed only by nobles and monasteries. But the European palate demanded changes. Over time, the chili and maize were replaced with sugar. Sugar changed everything. The bitter cacao drink of warriors became a sweet indulgence, seductive, luxurious, and deeply fashionable. In Spain and across Europe, chocolate became a marker of wealth and sophistication. Aristocrats sipped it at salons. Royalty demanded it at their table. Still, behind this delight lay a growing darkness. To feed Europe's hunger for chocolate and sugar, colonial plantations expanded, fueled by enslaved labor. The Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, and British all participated in building plantation economies. Millions of Africans were captured, shipped across the Atlantic, and forced to work under brutal conditions on cacao and sugar plantations. Many would spend their lives cultivating cacao, never tasting the chocolate bars their labor created. The human cost was staggering. Families were torn apart, cultures erased, generations suffered, all to satisfy the sweet tooth of Europe. By the 17th century, chocolate had evolved from a sacred Mesoamerican ritual into a fashionable European delicacy. Its taste delighted, but its history left a bitter residue: blood, suffering, and systemic injustice. Yet chocolate's popularity only grew, its association with love, luxury, and comfort deepening. The early 1800s saw a wave of innovation. In 1828, Dutch chemist Coenraad Johannes van Houten developed a hydraulic press to remove cacao butter from roasted beans, creating a fine powder that dissolved more easily in water and sugar. In 1847, the British company Fry & Sons created the first modern chocolate bar, combining cacao powder, cacao butter, and sugar into a moldable form. In the 1870s, Swiss chocolatiers Daniel Peter and Rudolf Lindt perfected milk chocolate and conking techniques, giving the world the silky smooth chocolate we know today. Industrialization made chocolate affordable and accessible. Brands like Cadbury, Nestlé, and Hershey transformed chocolate from elite luxury to everyday indulgence. Yet, even as chocolate became sweet, convenient, and mass-produced, its origins, the sacred cacao of Mesoamerican civilizations, were largely forgotten. In the early 2000s, a craft chocolate movement emerged, inspired by trends in coffee, wine, and slow food. Artisans began sourcing single-origin cacao, preserving the unique flavors of specific regions, soils, and fermentation methods. Ethical concerns, fair trade, direct trade, rainforest alliance, began to shape production. Chefs revived traditional Mesoamerican recipes, mixing cacao with chili, maize, and native spices, honoring the ancient roots of chocolate. With gods and empires, joy and exploitation, ritual and reinvention. Chocolate mirrors civilization itself, its ingenuity, resilience, and cultural fusion, but also its shadows, slavery, colonialism, and injustice. Yet chocolate endures. From ritual to recipe, from seed to symbol, chocolate evolves, adapts, and survives the rise and fall of civilizations. Every bite carries the flavor of history, sweet, bitter, and in between, a story still being written. The Trail of Tears. Cherokee and other native nations in the early decades of the 19th century, the United States was young and restless. Its population surged, and white settlers pressed westward, hungry for farmland, gold, and opportunity. To many, the American frontier promised divine right, but the land they coveted was already home to native nations: Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. These were sophisticated societies with political systems, written languages, newspapers, and schools. They were sovereign communities negotiating coexistence with the United States. The Cherokee, in particular, adopted many American practices to preserve autonomy. Drafting a constitution modeled after the U.S., practicing agriculture, converting to Christianity, publishing bilingual newspapers, and sending delegates to Washington. But assimilation was never enough for white settlers and politicians. They wanted the land. The discovery of gold in northern Georgia intensified pressures. President Andrew Jackson, a former general and advocate for removal, devised a solution: relocate native nations west of the Mississippi River to make way for plantations and settlement. Framed as protection, it was a calculated land grab. On May 28, 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law, authorizing the president to negotiate treaties exchanging eastern lands for territory in present-day Oklahoma. Supporters argued it would protect native peoples, but in reality, it facilitated dispossession and suffering. Some tribes agreed to relocate to avoid conflict. Others resisted, relying on treaties promising safe passage and compensation, but these promises were hollow. The removal process, intended as peaceful, became chaotic and violent. Families were uprooted, homes burned, crops destroyed. Soldiers enforced marches, leaving little time to gather belongings. The Cherokee fought legally, taking cases to the Supreme Court. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, 1831, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled the Cherokee were not a foreign nation and had no standing to sue. In Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, the court affirmed the Cherokee's sovereignty, but Jackson refused to enforce it. John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. A minority Cherokee faction, believing removal inevitable, signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835 without authorization from the Cherokee government. Congress ratified it, sealing the fate of the Cherokee Nation. By 1838, the U.S. government began forcibly removing Cherokee families from Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama. Soldiers arrived at homes with bayonets, giving families only moments to pack what they could carry. Homes were looted and burned, crops left to rot, churches and schools abandoned. More than 16,000 Cherokee were rounded up and placed in overcrowded, unsanitary stockades with little food, dirty water, and no shelter. Disease spread rapidly. Measles, dysentery, and whooping cough claimed lives even before the march began. In autumn, when conditions were deemed more favorable, groups were forced to begin the grueling journey west. The Cherokee called the route Nunadal Sunyi, the trail where they cried. The journey stretched roughly 1,200 miles across mountains, rivers, prairies, and snow. Elderly collapsed. Children died in their mothers' arms. Families vanished along the way, buried in shallow, unmarked graves. Some tried to maintain dignity, singing prayers and carrying sacred objects, but hunger and cold were relentless. By the time the last groups arrived in Indian Territory in early 1839, over 4,000 Cherokee had perished, nearly a quarter of their population. The suffering did not end with arrival. Survivors were weakened, grieving, and confronted with unfamiliar, often hostile land. Promises of fertile land, supplies, and protection were inconsistently honored or ignored. Tribal unity fractured. The treaty faction, seen as betrayers, faced retribution. In June 1839, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot were assassinated by fellow Cherokee. Even amidst devastation, the Cherokee endured. They rebuilt schools, re-established government, resumed publishing newspapers, and preserved language, stories, and faith. The Trail of Tears is not just history. It is living memory, carried in families, oral traditions, and the resilience of a people who were forced to leave everything behind. The Cherokee removal is the most remembered, but many other tribes suffered similar fates. The Choctaw were first, beginning in 1831, forced from Mississippi and Alabama. Thousands walked without wagons or adequate supplies through freezing rains and swollen rivers. Hundreds died. The Creek Nation followed. After years of broken treaties and violent clashes, over 15,000 were removed in 1836, many in chains. Thousands perished along the journey, while others were sold into slavery or scattered. The Chickasaw negotiated payment for their lands before removal, but their journey was no less brutal. Delays in compensation left them without resources, and hundreds died from disease and starvation during the march. Across these forced relocations, Native nations endured unimaginable loss. Land, homes, crops, sacred sites, elders, and cultural continuity were stripped away. Generations of knowledge and tradition were interrupted. Yet, despite betrayal and suffering, these nations survived, rebuilt, and maintained identity and resilience against overwhelming odds. The Trail of Tears, in its sorrow and endurance, remains a testament to human suffering, injustice, and resilience. It is a reminder that the march for land and empire came at an immense cost, and that the spirit of those removed persists, carrying memory, culture, and strength forward to the present day. If you want, I can continue and fully merge this Cherokee narrative seamlessly with the earlier cacao, chocolate history, so you have one long, cohesive, polished narrative from cacao to the Trail of Tears, all in the same flowing style. The forced removals of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and Chickasaw were part of a larger pattern across the United States. The Indian Removal Act, passed in 1830, did not discriminate among nations. It sought the lands of all native peoples in the Southeast. Each march westward was a repetition of grief. Families uprooted, ancestral lands abandoned, lives lost to hunger, disease, and exposure. Entire nations were displaced, yet their cultures, languages, and spiritual practices endured, carried quietly in memory, song, and story. While the U.S. expanded its borders, the world beyond these lands was also changing rapidly. In Europe, chocolate had become a symbol of sophistication, wealth, and indulgence. Factories churned out bars and confections for the growing middle class. In the Americas, settlers and traders sought to expand economies, relying on crops like cacao, sugar, and cotton, often cultivated under exploitative labor systems. The bitter sweetness of chocolate, once sacred, mirrored the bitter costs of expansion, conquest, and human suffering. In this duality lies a haunting symmetry. Just as cacao's journey from sacred Mesoamerican ritual to European luxury carried with it the weight of colonial exploitation, the westward march of the Cherokee carried the weight of broken treaties, stolen lands, and shattered communities. Both histories intertwine labor, resilience, loss, and survival. In one case, the fruits of the earth became a global commodity. In the other, the people of the land became an uprooted memory. Yet amid suffering, persistence endured. The Cherokee rebuilt, cultivating schools, governance, and culture in unfamiliar lands. Crafts, stories, and spiritual practices were preserved, ensuring that identity survived the erosion of displacement. Similarly, the knowledge of cacao persisted across centuries, surviving conquest, industrialization, and exploitation. Today, craft chocolate makers, indigenous communities, and ethical trade initiatives attempt to reclaim not only the flavor but the history of cacao, honoring the labor, tradition, and culture embedded in every bean. Both histories teach a fundamental lesson. Human ingenuity and cultural depth can endure even the harshest trials. Whether it is the bittersweet chocolate of Mesoamerica or the sorrowful journey of the Trail of Tears, survival is an act of remembering. Memory, passed through generations, ensures that the story, its beauty, tragedy, and resilience, is never truly lost. Modern chocolate, consumed in moments of celebration and comfort, carries echoes of its past. The sacred cacao rituals of the Maya, the warrior drinks of the Aztecs, the industrial bars of Europe, and the ethical awakenings of craft makers today. In every bite, there is history, joy and suffering intertwined, civilization and exploitation coexisting, memory and indulgence layered together. Likewise, the Cherokee and other native nations, though forcibly removed and scarred by loss, maintain a living history. Language, stories, and culture survived, carried forward through generations who refused to let memory die. Commemorations of the Trail of Tears, educational initiatives, and preservation of tribal sovereignty honor both resilience and the painful lessons of history. In the end, chocolate and the Trail of Tears, those separated by geography and circumstance, share a common truth. Every material and cultural journey is shaped by the hands, choices, and lives of human beings. Both remind us of endurance amid exploitation, creativity amid adversity, and the capacity to survive even when forces beyond control seek to erase us. Today, as we savor chocolate, we might also reflect on the journeys of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw peoples. We might recognize that behind sweetness lies struggle, and behind every human endeavor lies a story of triumph and suffering intertwined. To understand chocolate fully, or the Trail of Tears, is to understand the complexity of human history itself, the power, the pain, and the resilience that define the human experience. The soul of Florida resisted most fiercely. From 1835 to 1842, they waged guerrilla war against U.S. forces in the swamps and forests. Leaders like Osceola became symbols of resistance, but even the soul could not withstand the weight of U.S. military power forever. Thousands were captured or killed. Others were forcibly marched to Indian territory while a small group fled deep into the Everglades where their descendants remain today. In all, over 100,000 Native Americans from multiple nations were displaced during the removal era. The government called it policy, the settlers called it progress. But for Native peoples, it was catastrophe. Each nation's trail was different, but all shared the same themes: betrayal, suffering, and loss. Sacred homelands were stripped away. Cultural centers were shattered. The bonds of community, family, and memory were stretched to the brink. And yet, these nations carried their songs, their languages, and their spirit with them into a new land that did not welcome them, but where they would find ways to survive. When the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chassaw, and Soul finally arrived in Indian Territory, what is now the state of Oklahoma, they found a land that was nothing like the one they'd been forced to leave. The federal government had promised fertile soil, safety from further encroachment, and permanent ownership of their new homes. But those promises, like so many before, would prove fragile. The land was unfamiliar, the climate harsher. For many, it was difficult to grow crops or rebuild homes using traditional methods. Winters were bitter and unpredictable. Summer droughts scorched the earth. Communities were scattered, with many families arriving months apart or not at all. Diseases followed them: cholera, smallpox, influenza. Grief lived in every new settlement. The government aid that was promised, livestock, tools, food, and money often arrived late or not at all. Corruption plagued the system. Contractors cut corners. Supplies were spoiled. Resources meant to help resettled families start over were siphoned off by middlemen or bureaucrats with little oversight. Worse still, The land that had been guaranteed as a permanent Indian homeland was soon under threat. As settlers pushed westward and the borders of U.S. states crept closer, new pressures emerged. Railroads began to carve through the land. Treaties were rewritten or ignored under pressure or manipulation. What had been set aside as sovereign territory began to shrink once again. Despite these hardships, the nations worked to rebuild. The Cherokee reestablished their capital in Tahlequah and rebuilt schools and institutions. The Choctaw and Choctaw reorganized their governments. New constitutions were written, councils met, churches were built, farming resumed, communities began to heal, not by forgetting, but by enduring. And yet, even in Indian territory, the shadow of removal loomed. Every promise made to protect their new homeland was vulnerable to the same forces that had driven them from their original lands. Greed, expansion, and disregard. The land that was promised became a temporary refuge in a nation still unwilling to see native people as permanent rightful inhabitants. Though many believed they had finally found peace, history would soon prove otherwise. The story of the Trail of Tears didn't end in Indian territory. Simply turn the page to another long chapter in the struggle for survival, sovereignty, and respect. For decades after the forced removals, the Trail of Tears lived mostly in silence, spoken about in whispers, passed down through family stories, rarely acknowledged in textbooks or politics. It was a wound left open, a shared pain carried quietly by native communities, too often ignored by the nation that had caused it. Yet the memory survived. In Cherokee homes, elders told the story of the march west, of the cold, of the hunger, of the lost. Songs were sung in mourning. Ceremonies were held in remembrance. Oral history kept the names of those who walked and those who did not alive. The land remembered too. Old trails, shallow graves, and surviving documents marked the route like a scar across the heart of a continent. It was not just a trail of sorrow. It was a trail of survival. The resilience shown by native nations after removal defied the expectations of those who had tried to erase them. In the decades that followed, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Soul would not only rebuild, they would thrive. They formed new governments, ran schools, printed newspapers, and preserved languages and spiritual traditions. Against the odds, they endured. Still, the silence from outside their communities remained. Not until the late 20th century did wider America begin to reckon, even faintly, with the tragedy of the Trail of Tears. Activists and tribal leaders worked to reinsert the story into national memory. Memorials were erected, commemorative trails were marked, school curriculums were slowly updated. The phrase Trail of Tears became a recognized term, not just among historians, but in the national consciousness. But acknowledgement is not the same as justice. The effects of removal are still felt. The disconnection from ancestral lands, the historical trauma, and the legacy of broken promises continue to shape the realities of native communities today. Yet through every hardship, the strength of these nations endures. The same spirit that guided them through forests, across rivers, and into exile still lives on in language revival programs, cultural preservation efforts, and the stories told around fires and kitchen tables. The Trail of Tears is not just about what was lost. It's about what was carried forward. Faith, memory, and the unyielding will to survive. Today, the Trail of Tears is remembered not only as a historical event, but as a living memory, a reminder of injustice, of resilience, and of the strength it takes to carry a people forward when the world turns against them. The route that once echoed with footsteps of grief now serves as a sacred path of remembrance. Across the United States, monuments, trails, and museums mark the journey. The Trail of Tears, National Historic Trail, designated by Congress in 1987, stretches over 5,000 meters across 9 states, tracing the paths taken by those who were forced to march westward. It winds through forests, fields, and quiet towns, inviting visitors to walk, if only for a moment, in the footsteps of those who endured it. But true remembrance goes beyond monuments. For the descendants of those who walk the trail, memory lives in community, language, and ceremony. Tribal nations continue to honor their ancestors through annual memorial rides, storytelling gatherings, and language revitalization programs. What was once a story nearly silenced is now reclaimed and spoken with pride. Schools now teach it, films portray it, authors and poets give voice to the sorrow and strength of that era. And native youth grow up knowing that their identity is rooted in more than survival. It is rooted in courage, resistance, and continuity. Yet, there is still work to do. The Trail of Tears stands as a challenge to how history is told and remembered. It asks us to confront the cost of expansion, the cruelty behind policy, and the ongoing struggles faced by indigenous peoples. It reminds us that progress without humanity is not progress at all. It is erasure. To honor the Trail of Tears is to do more than look back. It is to listen, to learn, and to uplift the voices that once were pushed aside. It is to recognize that the story of America is incomplete without its native nations, not just in the past, but in the present and in every chapter yet to come. And so we remember, not just with sorrow, but with deep respect, because even in the face of betrayal and exile, the people walked forward and they did not vanish. They endured, for in the biting cold of early 1692, Salem Village, Massachusetts, was a place thick with unease. Tucked into the harsh New England wilderness, this Puritan settlement was more than just a collection of farms and meeting houses. It was a community teetering on the edge of spiritual and social collapse. The people of Salem believed they were God's chosen, placed in a wild and dangerous land to carve out a righteous life. But beneath their devotion simmered years of fear, tension, and division. The Puritans lived under a strict religious code. They believed in an invisible world filled with angels and demons. The devil, they were taught, was not a metaphor, but a real and active force. Witches, they believed, could sign the devil's book, casting spells and corrupting the innocent. To question this was to question Scripture. To doubt a minister was to challenge God. And Salem had no shortage of spiritual pressure. Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister, was a deeply polarizing figure. Harsh, suspicious, and often paranoid, he saw signs of sin everywhere. His sermons thundered with warnings of damnation and the devil's work. He divided the congregation with his fire and brimstone preaching, creating deep rifts among neighbors and families. Beyond the pulpit, Salem faced economic and political strain. A long-running feud between Salem Village and the wealthier Salem town caused constant tension. Land disputes were common, and the boundaries between property, belief, and personal grievance were often blurred. Old resentments lingered just beneath the surface. To make matters worse, the surrounding wilderness was a source of terror. The memory of brutal Native American attacks during King Philip's War was still fresh. Crops had failed the year before. Smallpox had swept through the region. In the Puritan mind, these disasters were not chance. They were punishment for hidden sins. It was in this atmosphere of religious anxiety, political rivalry, and survivalist dread that a group of young girls would begin to act strangely. Their sudden fits, wild accusations, and cries of witchcraft would not be dismissed as childish games. Not here, not in Salem, because in Salem, the devil was real. And in 1692, the villagers believed he had come to visit. It began, as many tragedies do, with children. In January of 1692, two young girls in Salem Village, 9-year-old Betty Parris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams, began to behave in alarming ways. They screamed, thrashed, and contorted their bodies into unnatural positions. They barked like dogs, hurled objects, and spoke in gibberish. When reprimanded, they wailed in pain and claimed they were being pinched or pricked by invisible forces. Their afflictions confounded the adults around them. Reverend Samuel Parris, Betty's father, initially saw the behavior as disturbing, but perhaps curable. A local doctor, William Griggs, examined the girls and gave a chilling diagnosis. They were under an evil hand. In a deeply religious and superstitious community like Salem, that meant only one thing: witchcraft. Soon, other girls began to display the same symptoms. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard joined the afflicted circle. Their fits escalated, drawing the attention of the entire village. These girls were not from the fringes of society. They were daughters of prominent families, respected members of the Puritan order. That gave their words weight. When pressed to name the cause of their suffering, the girls did something that would change the fate of the entire colony. They pointed fingers. The first to be accused was Tituba, an enslaved woman of Caribbean origin in the Parris household. She was a convenient target, foreign, non-white, and associated with stories and rituals that seemed exotic and suspect to Puritan eyes. Alongside her, the girls named two other local women, Sarah Good, a poor and often homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, who had scandalized the community by refusing to attend church and marrying her servant. Three women, each vulnerable in different ways, were suddenly the focus of an entire town's suspicion. They were arrested and jailed. For the villagers, this was a spiritual emergency. If witches walked among them, they had to be identified and purged. What had begun as an unexplained illness in a single household now spiraled into full-blown panic. And as the accusation spread, no one, not neighbors, not friends, not even family, would be safe from suspicion. Salem had opened the door to fear, and it would not be easily closed. In the early months of 1692, as more villages fell into hysterics and more names were whispered in fear, Salem's courts began relying on a kind of evidence never before used in any English-speaking legal system: spectral evidence. It would become the most controversial and damning tool of the trials and the most dangerous. Spectral evidence was based on the belief that a witch could send her spirit or specter to torment victims from afar. The afflicted girls would scream in court, claiming to see the accused person's ghost pinching, choking, or stabbing them, while the accused stood silently in front of them, often in disbelief. To the Puritan mind, this wasn't imagination or performance. It was considered valid proof of a pact with the devil. When the accused denied their guilt, they were accused of lying. And when they stayed silent, that too was seen as an admission of guilt. Those who confessed, however, were often spared execution, especially if they named other witches. This perverse incentive caused a wave of coerced confessions. Tituba, the enslaved woman accused first, confessed under pressure. She claimed that a tall man from Boston, clearly meant to suggest the devil, had visited her and promised her freedom if she served him. She described strange creatures, flying spirits, and even said she had seen a witch's book filled with signatures, implying that others in the village had also made deals with Satan. Her testimony was graphic, theatrical, and terrifying. Whether Tuba's confession was strategic, survival-driven, or partly imagined remains debated, but it had a powerful effect. It validated the girls' accusations and stoked public fear. If witches were real, and if they moved unseen, then anyone could be guilty. Soon more confessions followed. Some extracted under duress, others offered in hope of mercy. Those who refused to confess were often treated more harshly than those who admitted guilt. The line between truth and fantasy vanished in the candle-lit courtrooms. Hysteria drowned reason. Ministers urged caution, but too often their voices were ignored. Jails filled with the accused. Farmers, midwives, churchgoers, even children. The foundations of justice in Salem were crumbling. A town once governed by scripture and order now answered to visions, screams, and shadows. And still, the accusations grew. By the spring of 1692, the accusations had overwhelmed Salem's jails. What began as a local disturbance had spread into a full-blown judicial crisis with more than 100 people imprisoned and the colony struggling to process the chaos. In response, Massachusetts Governor William Phips established a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminina, meaning to hear and determine, specifically to handle the witchcraft cases. The court convened in Salem town, and its judges included respected men like William Stutton, Samuel Sue, and John Horn, but even their experience and stature couldn't shield the proceedings from hysteria. The rules of evidence bent to fear. Spectral evidence was accepted. Hearsay was common, and doubt, even skepticism, was considered dangerous. The first to be formally tried and executed was Bridget Bishop, a woman long suspected by neighbors of being unruly and outspoken. She wore bright clothing, ran a tavern, and had been accused of witchcraft years before, making her a perfect scapegoat. During her trial in June, the afflicted girls claimed to see her specter pinching and mocking them in the courtroom. When she denied all charges, her resistance was taken as proof of guilt. Bridget was convicted swiftly and hanged on June 10, 1692. She would not be the last. With her death, the machinery of accusation, trial, and execution accelerated. Week by week, more prisoners were brought before the judges. Some were pillars of their communities, church members, midwives, landowners. Others were beggars, widows, or former servants. What united them was not guilt but suspicion, and in many cases the misfortune of being disliked, envied, or simply misunderstood. The accused stood before a court where they had little hope. Their fate often depended on the theatrics of their accusers or the political winds of the day. Those who confessed and accused others were usually spared. Those who maintained innocence were more likely to be hanged. Fear fueled everything. Families turned on each other. Neighbors testified to save themselves. Ministers cautioned restraint, but their voices were drowned out by cries for purification. And overhead, a gallows was built on Proctor's Ledge, just outside Salem. It waited in silence as the town below fed its names one trial at a time. By the height of the summer of 1692, Salem was no longer a town. It was a furnace burning with fear, accusation, and righteous fury. The witch trials had moved beyond Salem village and Salem town, spreading like wildfire across neighboring communities. Ipes Switch, Andover, Gloucester, and others were soon gripped by the same fever. Accusations multiplied. Jails overflowed. No one was safe. The accused came from all walks of life. Some were outsiders, beggars, former slaves, women without families. Others were deeply rooted in the community. Church deacons, wealthy farmers, and even former accusers. Once the machinery of suspicion began to churn, it spared no one. Families were torn apart. Husbands and wives accused one another. Children testified against parents. Friends betrayed friends. Even those who questioned the legitimacy of the trials became targets. To doubt the existence of witches was in the minds of some to align with them. Nowhere was this madness more visible than in the behavior of the afflicted girls. During court proceedings, they cried out in pain, claimed to see spectral animals, mimicked the accused, and fainted in unison. Their performance became central to the prosecution's case, regardless of how implausible or theatrical it seemed. The court took their suffering as proof, their screams as divine evidence. By the end of summer, more than 150 people had been arrested, and the executions continued. Sarah Good, a homeless woman, was hanged in July after refusing to confess. Her defiance was seen not as strength but as rebellion against God. Rebecca Nurse, a respected grandmother and member of the Salem Church, was executed despite widespread protest. Her conviction sent a chilling message. Even the most pious were not beyond suspicion, and yet the accusations did not slow. Children as young as 5 were jailed. A minister's wife was accused. Entire families were locked in cells. The colony had lost its grip on reason, consumed by the very evil it sought to destroy. Fear was now Salem's true ruler, shaping justice, warping memory, and silencing dissent. What began as a handful of strange afflictions had become something far more terrifying. A society devouring itself, one accusation at a time. As summer gave way to autumn in 1692, the Salem witch trials reached their darkest depths. The gallows on Proctor's Ledge became a grim fixture on the horizon, a place of ritual execution where cries for mercy were swallowed by the silence of final judgment. The executions were public, meant to serve as warnings. Entire communities gathered to watch. Some came in solemn fear. Others disturbingly treated them as spectacles. One by one, the convicted were led to the scaffold, bound and praying until the trapdoors dropped and another life ended in the name of righteousness. In total, 19 people were hanged as witches, 14 women and 5 men. All maintained their innocence. Many died with prayers on their lips or psalms recited through trembling voices. None of them received proper burials. As convicted witches, their bodies were denied church cemeteries. Some were buried in shallow, unmarked graves. Others were reclaimed secretly by family under cover of night. But the most gruesome death was not on the gallows. Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer and the husband of accused witch Martha Corey, refused to enter a plea at his trial. By refusing to speak, he hoped to prevent his land from being seized by the state. In response, authorities ordered pressing, a brutal and rare form of punishment. Giles was stripped, laid on the ground, and slowly crushed beneath heavy stones. For 2 days, he endured the torture in silence. His last words, according to legend, were chillingly defiant. More weight. He died without ever entering a plea. His resistance made him a tragic symbol of the injustice that had overtaken Salem. Inside the jails, those not yet executed faced horrific conditions. Pregnant women gave birth in filthy cells. The sick died of neglect. Families had to pay for their own food in chains, and some remained imprisoned for months after the trials ended. By the time autumn leaves began to fall, Salem had sentenced more people to death for witchcraft than any other community in American history. What had begun as whispers had ended in blood, and though the executions would soon cease, the damage to Salem's soul had already been done. By the end of September 1692, the fever that had gripped Salem began to falter. The turning point came not from the courts or the clergy, but from a growing sense of unease. A recognition too long delayed that something had gone terribly wrong. Doubt crept in quietly. It started when respected citizens like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor were hanged. If such devout, upright people could be witches, who could be trusted? When Martha Corey, a strong-willed churchgoer, and even the wife of the colony's former governor, Lady Mary Phipps, were accused, the trials began to eat into the upper ranks of society. The hysteria no longer threatened just the marginalized. It threatened everyone. Reverend Incra Mather, a prominent Puritan minister and father of the influential Cotton Mather, delivered a powerful sermon against the use of spectral evidence, the very foundation of many convictions. In his words, "It is better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned." It was a radical reversal in tone and a quiet indictment of the court's methods. Others began to speak out as well. Ministers who had once supported the trials now urged caution. Families of the accused pleaded publicly. Communities neighboring Salem watched with horror and began distancing themselves. Faced with rising criticism and political pressure, Governor William Phipps finally acted. In October 1692, he disbanded the court of Oyer and Terminina. In its place, a new court was created, one that no longer accepted spectral evidence. The change was immediate. Of the remaining prisoners awaiting trial, most were found not guilty. For those convicted, many received reprieves. The execution stopped. Still, the damage had been done. 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, over 100 imprisoned, dozens more traumatized, families ruined, reputations shattered. The tide had turned, but slowly, though the courts had changed, it would take months, years, for the last prisoners to be released, and longer still for the community to fully reckon with its sins. But in that autumn, the panic receded. Silence returned to the gallows. The accuser's screams faded, and Salem, wounded and ashamed, was left to confront the cold reality that it had been not witches but fear itself that had ruled them. When the final prisoners were released in 1693, Salem was left with more than empty cells. It was left with guilt. The trials had ended, but the echoes of accusation, betrayal, and execution lingered in every home and church pew. A silence hung over the town, and beneath it a deep unease. In the years that followed, many of those involved in the trials began to express regret. One of the most striking apologies came from Judge Samuel Seow. On a January day in 1697, during a day of public fasting and prayer, Sewell stood before the congregation at Boston's South Church. In front of the entire assembly, he accepted blame and shame for his role in the trials and asked God for forgiveness. It was a rare act of public contrition, and it set the tone for the years that followed. Others were not so quick to apologize. Some judges and accusers remained silent or stood by their decisions, believing they had acted in good faith. But the growing consensus, especially among clergy, was that the court had erred terribly. Even Cotton Mather, who had initially defended the use of spectral evidence, softened his tone in later writings. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the original accusers, only a child during the trials, offered a formal confession before her church. She admitted that her accusations had led to the deaths of innocent people. She claimed she had been deluded by Satan and begged forgiveness from God and her neighbors. Her words were among the few to acknowledge the specific names of the victims. Families of the accused struggled for decades to clear their relatives' names. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill restoring the civil rights of many of those convicted and awarded monetary compensation to their heirs. But the pain remained. Not all names were cleared and not all families were compensated. Generations grew up in the shadow of the trials, and yet over time Salem tried to heal. The town became a symbol not of justice but of what happens when fear overrides reason, when courts abandon fairness, and when hysteria is mistaken for truth. The reckoning had begun, but full justice, as history often shows, would remain elusive. More than 3 centuries have passed since the gallows stood in Salem, but the legacy of the witch trials endures, etched into American memory, not as a tale of sorcery, but as a grim warning about the power of fear, the fragility of justice, and the danger of unchecked belief. The very phrase Salem witch trials has come to symbolize mass hysteria, false accusations, and moral panic. It is invoked in courtrooms, classrooms, and political speeches as a cautionary tale. Proof of how easily reason can be overwhelmed by suspicion and how quickly a community can turn on its own. Today, Salem embraces its history, but not without complexity. Museums, memorials, and guided tours draw visitors from around the world. The Salem Witch Trials Memorial, dedicated in 1992 on the 300th anniversary of the trials, features 20 granite benches, each inscribed with the name of one of the executed. They do not list their crimes because there were none, only names, dates, and final words, testaments to dignity in the face of injustice. Yet even now, Salem's story is more than just tourism or folklore. It is a reflection of human nature. The trials reveal how fear can become contagious, how power can be abused in the name of morality, and how justice can falter when guided by emotion rather than evidence. In literature, Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, gave new life to the trials, using them as an allegory for McCarthyism and the Red Scare of the 1950s. Miller reminded a new generation that witch hunts do not always involve witches and that the past is never as distant as it seems. The descendants of the accused and the accusers still live in Massachusetts and across the United States. Some bear the burden of ancestral shame. Others carry the pride of resilience and survival. In 2001, more than 3 centuries after the hangings, the state of Massachusetts formally exonerated the last 5 victims, completing the legal clearing of all accused. The Salem witch trials were brief, just over a year in length, but their lessons have proven eternal. They remind us that truth must be defended even when fear shouts louder, and that the gravest injustices can occur not in moments of darkness, but under the full light of day. The soul of Florida resisted most fiercely. From 1835 to 1842, they waged guerrilla war against U.S. forces in the swamps and forests. Leaders like Osceola became symbols of resistance, yet even the soul could not endure the relentless weight of U.S. military power indefinitely. Thousands were captured or killed. Others were forcibly marched to Indian Territory, while a small group fled deep into the Everglades, where their descendants live today. In total, over 100,000 Native Americans from multiple nations were displaced during the removal era. The government called it policy, the settlers called it progress, but for Native peoples, it was catastrophe. Each nation's trail was distinct, yet all shared the same themes: betrayal, suffering, and loss. Sacred homelands were stripped away. Cultural centers were shattered. The bonds of community, family, and memory were stretched to the breaking point. And yet, these nations carried their songs, languages, and spirit into a new land that did not welcome them, but where they would find ways to survive. When the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seoul finally arrived in Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, they found a land unlike the one they had been forced to leave. The federal government had promised fertile soil, safety from further encroachment, and permanent ownership of their new homes. But those promises, like so many before, proved fragile. The land was unfamiliar, the climate harsher. For many, growing crops or rebuilding homes using traditional methods was difficult. Winters were bitter and unpredictable. Summer droughts scorched the earth. Communities were scattered, with many families arriving months apart, or not at all. Diseases followed them: cholera, smallpox, influenza. Grief permeated every new settlement. Government aid, promised in the form of livestock, tools, food, and money, often arrived late or not at all. Corruption plagued the system. Contractors cut corners. Supplies were spoiled. Resources meant to help resettled families start anew were siphoned off by middlemen or bureaucrats with little oversight. Worse still, the land guaranteed as a permanent Indian homeland was soon under threat. As settlers pushed westward and state borders crept closer, new pressures emerged. Railroads began carving through the territory. Treaties were rewritten or ignored under pressure or manipulation. What had been set aside as sovereign land began to shrink again. Despite these hardships, the nations rebuilt. The Cherokee reestablished their capital at Taloqua and rebuilt schools and institutions. The Choctaw and Chickasaw reorganized their governments. New constitutions were drafted, councils met, churches were built. Farming resumed. Communities began to heal, not by forgetting, but by enduring. Yet even in Indian territory, the shadow of removal loomed. Every promise of protection was vulnerable to the same forces that had driven them from their original lands: greed, expansion, and disregard. The land that had been promised became a temporary refuge in a nation still unwilling to see native peoples as permanent, rightful inhabitants. Though many believed they had finally found peace, history would prove otherwise. The story of the Trail of Tears did not end in Indian territory. It simply turned the page to another long chapter in the struggle for survival, sovereignty, and respect. For decades after the forced removals, the Trail of Tears lived mostly in silence, spoken in whispers, passed down through family stories, rarely acknowledged in textbooks or politics. It was a wound left open, a shared pain carried quietly by native communities, too often ignored by the nation that had caused it. Yet memory survived. In Cherokee homes, elders told the story of the march west, of the cold, hunger, and loss. Songs were sung in mourning. Ceremonies were held in remembrance. Oral history kept alive the names of those who walked and those who did not. The land remembered too. Old trails, shallow graves, and surviving documents marked the route like a scar across the heart of a continent. It was not just a trail of sorrow, it was a trail of survival. The resilience shown by native nations after removal defied the expectations of those who had tried to erase them. In the decades that followed, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Soul not only rebuilt, they thrived. They formed new governments, ran schools, printed newspapers, and preserved languages and spiritual traditions. Against the odds, they endured. Still, silence from outside their communities remained. Not until the late 20th century did wider America begin to reckon, however faintly, with the tragedy of the Trail of Tears. Activists and tribal leaders worked to reinsert the story into national memory. Memorials were erected, commemorative trails were marked, school curricula were slowly updated. The phrase, Trail of Tears, became recognized not just among historians, but in national consciousness. Acknowledgement, however, is not the same as justice. The effects of removal are still felt. Disconnection from ancestral lands, historical trauma, and the legacy of broken promises continue to shape the realities of native communities today. Yet through every hardship, the strength of these nations endures. The same spirit that guided them through forests, across rivers, and into exile still lives on in language revival programs, cultural preservation efforts, and stories told around fires and kitchen tables. The Trail of Tears is not just about what was lost. It is about what was carried forward: faith, memory, and the unyielding will to survive. Today, it is remembered not only as a historical event, but as a living memory, a reminder of injustice, resilience, and the strength it takes to carry a people forward when the world turns against them. The route that once echoed with footsteps of grief now serves as a sacred path of remembrance. Across the United States, monuments, trails, and museums mark the journey. The Trail of Tears National Historic Trail, designated by Congress in 1987, stretches over 5,000 miles across 9 states, tracing the paths taken by those forced westward. It winds through forests, fields, and quiet towns, inviting visitors to walk, if only for a moment, in the footsteps of those who endured it. True remembrance, however, goes beyond monuments. For the descendants of those who walk the trail, memory lives in community, language, and ceremony. Tribal nations honor their ancestors through annual memorial rides, storytelling gatherings, and language revitalization programs. What was once nearly silenced is now reclaimed and spoken with pride. Schools teach it, films portray it, authors and poets give voice to the sorrow and strength of that era. Native youth grow up knowing that their identity is rooted in more than survival. It is rooted in courage, resistance, and continuity. Yet work remains. The Trail of Tears challenges how history is told and remembered. It asks us to confront the cost of expansion, the cruelty behind policy, and the ongoing struggles faced by indigenous peoples. It reminds us that progress without humanity is not progress at all. It is erasure. To honor the Trail of Tears is to do more than look back. It is to listen, learn, and uplift the voices once pushed aside. It is to recognize that the story of America is incomplete without its native nations, not just in the past, but in the present and every chapter yet to come. And so we remember, not just with sorrow, but with deep respect. For even in the face of betrayal and exile, the people walked forward, and they did not vanish. They endured, for in the biting cold of early 1692, Salem Village, Massachusetts, was a place thick with unease. Tucked into the harsh New England wilderness, this Puritan settlement was more than a collection of farms and meeting houses. It was a community teetering on the edge of spiritual and social collapse. The people of Salem believed they were God's chosen, placed in a wild and dangerous land to carve out a righteous life. Yet beneath their devotion simmered years of fear and tension. The Puritans lived under a strict religious code. They believed in an invisible world filled with angels and demons. The devil, they were taught, was real and active. Witches, they believed, could make pacts with Satan, casting spells and corrupting the innocent. To question this was to question Scripture. To doubt a minister was to challenge God. Salem had no shortage of spiritual pressure. Reverend Samuel Parris, the village minister, was polarizing. Harsh, suspicious, and often paranoid. He saw signs of sin everywhere. His sermons thundered warnings of damnation, creating deep rifts among neighbors and families. Beyond the pulpit, Salem faced economic and political strain. A long-standing feud between Salem Village and the wealthier Salem town caused constant tension. Land disputes were common. Old resentments lingered beneath the surface. It was in this atmosphere that a group of young girls began to act strangely. In January 1692, two young girls, 9-year-old Betty Parris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams, began contorting, screaming, and speaking in gibberish. When reprimanded, they cried that invisible forces were attacking them. Reverend Parris initially saw the behavior as disturbing but curable. Dr. William Griggs examined them and diagnosed them as being under an evil hand. In Salem, that meant only one thing: witchcraft. Soon, other girls joined. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard displayed the same symptoms. They were daughters of prominent families, which gave their accusations weight. The first accused was Tituba, an enslaved woman in Parris's household, alongside Sarah Good, a poor beggar, and Sarah Osborne, a woman who had defied local norms. Arrested and jailed, these women became the focus of the town's fear. What began as an illness in a single household spiraled into full-blown panic. The Massachusetts courts soon relied on spectral evidence, a belief that witches could send their spirits to torment victims. The afflicted girls would testify that the accused ghost tormented them, while the accused stood before them. Denials were interpreted as lies. Silence was proof of guilt. Confessions, often coerced, were rewarded, which fueled more accusations. Tituba confessed, describing strange creatures, flying spirits, and a witch's book. Her confession validated the girls' claims and stoked public fear. Soon, more confessions followed, some under duress, others hoping for mercy. Those who refused to confess faced harsher punishments. The line between truth and fantasy vanished. By spring 1692, over 100 people were imprisoned, and the court of Oyer and Termine was established to handle the cases. The first formally tried and executed was Bridget Bishop on June 10, 1692. Accusations and executions multiplied rapidly. Women and men from all walks of life were condemned. Fear dominated Salem. Families turned on each other. Ministers' warnings were drowned out by cries for purification. The gallows on Proctor's Ledge awaited each new victim. By summer, the hysteria had engulfed neighboring towns. Public executions became ritualized spectacles. 19 people were hanged, and Giles Corey was pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to plead. Jails were overcrowded, conditions abysmal. By autumn, doubt began to creep in. Respectable citizens had been executed, questioning the legitimacy of spectral evidence. Reverend Increase Mather condemned it in sermons. Governor William Phipps disbanded the court, replacing it with one that no longer accepted spectral evidence. The executions ceased, but the damage endured. Families, reputations, and communities were destroyed. Judge Samuel Sewall publicly confessed his guilt in 1697. Ann Putnam Jr., one of the original accusers, formally admitted in 1706 that she had been deluded. In 1711, the legislature restored civil rights to many victims' descendants and offered compensation, but the pain remained. Salem became a symbol not of justice, but of the destructive power of fear, hysteria, and moral panic. Arthur Miller's The Crucible later revived the story as a warning about McCarthyism. The legacy endures. Fear can override reason, power can corrupt morality, and justice can falter when guided by emotion. Today, Salem honors its history through museums, memorials, and tours. The Salem Witch Trials Memorial, dedicated in 1992, commemorates those executed with dignity, listing only names, dates, and final words. In 2001, Massachusetts formally exonerated the last 5 victims, completing the clearing of all accused. More than 3 centuries later, the lessons remain eternal. Defend truth against fear, recognize injustice, and remember the dangers of unchecked belief. The histories of the Trail of Tears and the Salem Witch Trials, though separated by over a century and different contexts, share a haunting resonance. Both are stories of fear, injustice, and the resilience of the human spirit. In one, Native nations were uprooted from their homelands, forced to march through disease, starvation, and uncertainty. In the other, a community consumed itself with suspicion and paranoia, turning neighbors into enemies and faith into a weapon of fear. In both cases, the cost was immense: lives lost, families torn apart, and generations marked by trauma. Yet in both, there is a remarkable endurance. The descendants of those who walked the Trail of Tears rebuilt their communities, preserved their cultures, and reclaimed their stories. The survivors of Salem, and those who remembered their names, eventually sought justice, apology, and historical reckoning. Memory became their weapon, a way to ensure the past would not be forgotten, and that lessons would be carried forward. History is rarely neat. It is messy, painful, and often silent. But these stories remind us that courage and integrity can survive even the darkest periods. They teach that justice must be protected, that truth must be defended, and that humanity cannot be sacrificed to fear or greed. Monuments, memorials, schools, and stories keep the memory alive. Yet the true lesson lives in how we act today, how we recognize injustice, support the vulnerable, and honor the resilience of those who came before us. The Trail of Tears and the Salem Witch Trials are more than historical events. They are living reminders. They call on us to confront uncomfortable truths, to question the motives behind power and policy, and to ensure that such tragedies are neither repeated nor forgotten. They tell us that though fear, oppression, and cruelty may rise, the human spirit, rooted in memory, resistance, and survival, endures. As we walk the paths of remembrance, we carry forward both sorrow and strength. We remember the names, the voices, the lives lost, and the courage of those who endured. And in doing so, we honor a fundamental truth, that history is not just what happened. It is what we choose to learn, to preserve, and to pass on. In remembering, we keep alive the resilience, dignity, and spirit of humanity, ensuring that even in the face of